The master of this grand mansion is a millionaire who lives by strict discipline, keeping everything including his son's life firmly under control. But his carefully constructed world begins to crack when he discovers the boy secretly learning to dance from a black housemaid, a woman with a glorious past she desperately wants to keep hidden. At first, anger takes hold, but as he witnesses his son's transformation, he makes an unexpected decision, supporting him in a dance competition and allowing him to pursue his passion. The Montgomery estate was a masterpiece of modern architecture: glass walls, sleek steel beams, and sprawling green lawns that stretched beyond the horizon. Inside, the air was crisp, controlled, every surface polished to perfection. The silence was almost sacred, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock in the hallway. William Montgomery, real estate magnate, millionaire, and the epitome of discipline, thrived in this order. He had built an empire on control, on precision. Chaos was an enemy, emotions a liability. His son, Theodore Montgomery, was expected to follow suit. 12 years old, quiet, reserved, a boy shaped by expectations rather than desires. Since his mother's passing, William had ensured that his son's life remained structured, efficient, devoid of distractions that could lead to weakness. Tutors, etiquette lessons, rigorous academic schedules, everything designed to mold Theodore into a successor worthy of the Montgomery legacy. But today, something was wrong. William descended the grand staircase, a fresh cup of black coffee in hand. He liked this moment of the day, the transition from his morning meetings to his afternoon briefings. It was a time when he could collect his thoughts, survey his domain, ensure that everything remained as it should be. But as he reached the hallway that overlooked the garden, his steps came to an abrupt halt. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling window, he saw his son dancing. At first, he thought his eyes were deceiving him. Theodore, the boy who barely spoke at the dinner table, who never showed interest in anything beyond his books, was moving across the grass in a clumsy yet oddly determined rhythm. And he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, guiding him, her movements fluid, precise. Amara Johnson, the housemaid. His fingers tightened around the porcelain cup, the heat pressing into his palm as irritation bloomed in his chest. "The hell is this?" he muttered under his breath. Outside, Amara was correcting Theodore's posture, her voice warm yet firm. "Slow down your steps," she instructed, adjusting his stance. "There you go, now feel the rhythm." Theodore let out a small laugh, an unguarded, carefree laugh that William hadn't heard in years. "Like this, Miss Amara?" "Better," she nodded. "But you have to loosen up. You're too stiff." William's jaw clenched. His son was smiling. Because of her. A woman who was hired to cook, to clean, to be invisible, not to instruct, not to hold influence over his household, and certainly not over his son. The coffee in his grip had long gone cold, but he didn't move. He watched, expression unreadable, as Theodore stumbled slightly, then laughed it off, a reaction William did not recognize. If the boy had made such a mistake under his father's gaze, he would have tensed, apologized, corrected himself immediately. But here with her, he was light, unburdened. A foreign sensation crept up William's spine, something he refused to name. He turned sharply, setting his untouched coffee on a side table with more force than necessary. His footsteps echoed through the marble-floored hallway as he made his way to the garden, his presence an oncoming storm. By the time he stepped outside, Theodore had stopped moving. The light in his expression vanished, shoulders tensing at the sight of his father. The laughter that had filled the air seconds ago was gone, replaced by a silence so thick it felt suffocating. Amara, however, did not flinch. William stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his gaze sharp and assessing. "What exactly is going on here?" His voice was controlled, but there was an edge beneath it, cold and unwavering. Theodore looked down, shuffling his feet. I was just learning how to dance." William's eyes flicked to Amara, then back to his son. His tone hardened. "And you thought the housemaid was the appropriate person to teach you?" Theodore hesitated, but Amara spoke before he could. "He wanted to learn. I was simply helping." William turned his gaze fully on her, expression unreadable, though his displeasure was palpable. "Helping," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. Then his voice dropped, icier than before. I don't recall hiring you to educate my son. Amara met his gaze without hesitation. A mistake. She should have looked away, should have remembered her place. With all due respect, Mr. Montgomery, she said, her tone steady, I wasn't aware that teaching a child to find joy in movement was considered overstepping. William's fingers curled into a fist at his side, though his face remained impassive. Joy. A foolish concept. Discipline, structure, order, those were the foundations of success. Not this. Theodore, he said, voice cutting through the air like a blade inside. Now. The boy hesitated, glancing at Amara as if searching for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps permission. William hated that. Theo, he repeated, sharper. Reluctantly, Theodore obeyed, his steps slow, dragging, as if the weight of his father's authority pressed upon him with every movement. As the boy disappeared into the house, William turned back to Amara. The silence between them was thick, charged. She didn't look intimidated. That, more than anything, infuriated him. I don't like mysteries in my house, Miss Johnson. His voice was low, deliberate. You do well to remember that. Amara didn't even blink. And I don't like seeing a child forget how to smile. A muscle in William's jaw twitched. He had built an empire on knowing how to command a room, on ensuring that every person in his presence understood who held the power. Yet this woman, this employee, spoke as if they stood on even ground. His silence should have been enough to end the conversation. A warning. But instead she held his gaze not in defiance but in something far worse. Conviction. The very idea that she thought she had any right to opinions in his home about his son was offensive. Without another word, he turned and strode back into the house, but the unease remained, settling in his chest like an unfamiliar weight. He would get to the bottom of this. Amara Johnson was not just a maid. William sat in his office, the dim glow of his computer screen casting sharp shadows across his angular features. The glass of bourbon he had poured himself remained untouched on the mahogany desk. His mind was elsewhere, his focus locked on the name displayed in bold letters on the screen. Amara Johnson. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he pressed enter, initiating a deep search. He wasn't the type to let questions go unanswered. And this woman, this housemaid with too much poise, too much presence, had raised too many. A list of generic employment records appeared first. Housekeeping jobs, catering work, nothing remarkable. Nothing that explained what he had seen. But William wasn't a man who stopped at surface-level information. He narrowed the search parameters, refined the keywords. And then he found it. A New York Times article, dated 7 years ago. Ballet prodigy Amara Johnson mysteriously withdraws from stage after tragic loss. William's eyes narrowed as he clicked on the headline. The article unfolded before him, revealing a photo of a younger Amara, frozen in time. She was dressed in an elegant white ballet costume, poised mid-pirouette, her arms extended with the kind of effortless grace that only came from years of mastery. The caption below read, Amara Johnson, rising star of the American Ballet Theater, once hailed as one of the most promising dancers of her generation. William leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. A ballet dancer, he muttered under his breath, incredulous. And now she scrubs floors. The article chronicled her meteoric rise, her performances in some of the most prestigious theaters in the world, the critical acclaim, the invitations to international tours. And then, just as she was on the brink of superstardom, she disappeared. No farewell performance, no announcement, just gone. His jaw tightened as he continued reading. Her fiancé, Adrian Carter, had been killed in a car accident the night before her biggest performance. They had trained together since childhood, their partnership on stage described as flawless, almost telepathic. His death had devastated the ballet community, but more importantly, it had destroyed her. Johnson withdrew from the company immediately after the funeral. She has not performed since, and all attempts to reach her have gone unanswered. William exhaled sharply. He had expected something, an arrest record, a scandal, a reason to dismiss her presence in his home as an inconvenience. Instead, he found this. A woman who had been on the precipice of greatness, only to abandon everything. And now she was here, teaching his son. He ran a hand over his face, irritation simmering beneath the surface. Why? What was she running from? Or worse, what was she trying to find? His gaze flicked toward the hallway. He was a man who built his empire on instinct, on knowing when something wasn't as it seemed. And this wasn't just some ex-ballerina looking for a quiet job. He wasn't going to wait for the answers to come to him. William stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he grabbed his phone. He strode out of the office with purpose, his footsteps sharp against the polished floors. It was time for some answers. The kitchen was quiet except for the faint sound of water running from the sink. Amara stood at the counter, methodically drying a plate, her movements unhurried. If she noticed William's entrance, she gave no indication. Without a word, he placed his phone down on the marble counter, the screen still displaying the New York Times article with her photograph front and center. "Clever of you," he said smoothly, watching her closely. "But you should know there's no such thing as disappearing completely." Amara finally glanced at the screen. Her eyes flickered over the article, her face unreadable. Then she exhaled softly, placing the dish towel down with deliberate care. "I suppose I should have expected this," she murmured. William studied her reaction, no panic, no denial. Just a quiet acceptance. That irritated him more than anything. "You were a star." His voice was clipped, precise. "One of the best. And now you're cleaning my floors. So tell me, Miss Johnson, why does a woman with your talent throw it all away?" Amara met his gaze then, her expression steady, unapologetic. "Because I lost the reason to keep going." Her voice was calm, but something in it carried weight, an undercurrent of grief that was too deep, too lived in to be performative. William held her stare, his mind calculating, assessing. He had expected deflection, an excuse, maybe even a lie, but not this kind of honesty. He tapped his fingers against the counter, considering his next words carefully. Then, with measured curiosity, he said, "I know what it's like to lose something, but most people don't quit. They find a way to move forward." Amara tilted her head slightly, studying him in return. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, she asked, "Is that what you did?" The question landed like a blow, subtle yet direct. William's expression remained impassive, but inside, something twisted. A memory he didn't want to entertain, a loss of his own. He exhaled through his nose, his irritation now mixed with something else. Something dangerously close to understanding. "I don't allow weakness in my house," he said finally. "Whatever this connection is between you and my son, it stops now." Amara held his gaze, unwavering. "If you say so, Mr. Montgomery." But she didn't look away. And for the first time, William wasn't sure if he had truly won this conversation. Dinner was a quiet affair in the Montgomery household, as it always was. The long, polished dining table stretched between father and son, an unspoken chasm of formality keeping them at opposite ends. The chandeliers cast a warm glow over the pristine white plates, the silverware clinking softly as William methodically cut his steak. Theodore sat across from him, his back straight, his hands resting neatly on either side of his plate, just as he had been taught. But something about the boy's posture was different tonight. A tension lingered in his shoulders, an energy he was struggling to contain. William noticed. He always noticed. Halfway through the meal, Theodore finally put down his fork. He took a steady breath, then lifted his gaze to meet his father's. "I want to compete in a dance tournament." The room seemed to shrink into silence. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway grew unbearably loud. William, mid-motion, stilled. The knife in his hand hovered just above his plate before he set it down with precise, deliberate care. He reached for his glass, took a slow sip of wine, then placed it back down as if measuring the weight of his own reaction. At last he looked at his son. "Do you even understand what competition means, Theodore?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Theodore didn't flinch. "Yes." William leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Competition isn't about fun. It's about pressure. It's about failure." His gaze sharpened. "And you don't handle failure well." A flicker of something passed over Theodore's face. Hurt, maybe, but it was gone in an instant. Instead of shrinking under the weight of his father's words, the boy's expression hardened. I know it won't be easy, but I want to do this. William studied him, searching for hesitation. There was none. Theodore, the son he had raised to be cautious, calculated, had just declared his intent to step into something unpredictable, something that could break him. And yet, he was meeting his father's gaze with something William hadn't seen in a long time: conviction. The millionaire exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the table. A long pause stretched between them, heavy with the weight of an unspoken decision. Then, finally, William nodded once. Fine. Theodore blinked, as if he had been preparing for a battle that never came. But William continued, his voice dropping into something more measured. If you're going to do this, you do it properly. No half measures. No excuses. His tone left no room for negotiation. I wouldn't want it any other way, Theodore replied, his chin lifting slightly. William turned his attention to the woman standing quietly near the doorway. He had known she was there. Amara had a way of making herself present yet unnoticed, watching, waiting. Her expression was unreadable, but something about the way she held herself told him she had expected this moment. His gaze locked onto hers. If you've started this, then finish it. Amara studied him for a moment before offering a small, knowing smile. I don't do things halfway, Mr. Montgomery. William huffed, unimpressed. We'll see. And just like that, the decision was made. But William knew, as he glanced back at his son, that something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Theodore was standing on his own. The sun had barely risen over the Montgomery estate when Theodore stepped into the ballroom turned practice studio. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and echoes of past rehearsals. The room was vast. Mirrors lined the walls, reflecting every movement, every imperfection. At the center stood Amara, arms crossed, her stance sharp with expectation. Again. Theodore's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, sweat clinging to his temples. His muscles ached from the hours of drills, but Amara's expression remained unreadable. There was no sympathy, no indulgence, only the unyielding demand for more. Your footwork is still sloppy, she continued, stepping forward. You're letting the music control you. That's not how this works. You control the rhythm. You decide the movement. Now again. Theodore swallowed, forcing himself back into position. The music swelled, and he pushed forward, every step carrying the weight of his own determination. From the doorway, William watched. He hadn't intended to stay. At first he had come merely to check to ensure that this wasn't a waste of time. But now, standing in the shadows, arms folded across his chest, he found himself unable to leave. This was not the same boy who had hesitated under his father's gaze at the dinner table. This was someone else entirely. Someone relentless, someone hungry. And for the first time, William wondered if he had underestimated his own son. The training pushed Theodore beyond anything he had ever known. The exhaustion was suffocating, the doubt a quiet whisper in the back of his mind. Every day was a war between his body and his will, and some nights he wondered if he had made a mistake. Amara never let up. She corrected without hesitation, criticized without apology. There were no gentle words, no reassurances, only sharp, unwavering truth. This isn't about talent, Theodore, she told him one evening, as he collapsed onto the floor after a particularly grueling session. It's about discipline, about how much you can take before you break. Because if you can't handle failing here, you won't survive out there. Theodore gritted his teeth, pushing himself back up. Then I'll make sure I don't break. A flicker of something approval maybe passed through Amara's eyes, but she said nothing, only nodding once. One night after training, Theodore found his father in the study. William sat at his desk, reviewing documents, but as soon as Theodore stepped inside, he closed the folder. The boy hesitated before speaking. There's a kid at the tournament, Jackson Hayes. William leaned back in his chair. And? He's won the past 2 years. Everyone says I don't stand a chance against him. Theodore's fingers curled at his sides. He told me that himself. For a long moment, William said nothing. Then, a slow, knowing smile touched his lips. Well, he said, sounds like you've already gotten under his skin. Theodore frowned. What? William stood, walking toward his son with measured steps. People only try to break you down when they see you as a threat. If Jackson didn't think you were worth noticing, he wouldn't have said a word to you. Theodore's doubt wavered. Now, William continued, a hint of amusement in his tone. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Theodore met his father's gaze, something stealing inside him. I'm going to prove him wrong. For the first time, William saw at the fire, the drive, the refusal to back down. And he knew then, without a doubt, his son was ready. As the days of training bled into nights of exhaustion, Theodore pushed himself beyond limits he hadn't known existed. Every misstep, every failure, every moment of doubt had led to this: the stage, the lights, the moment where everything he had fought for would be decided. And now, as he stood in the wings, heart hammering in his chest, he knew there was no turning back. The auditorium was alive with energy, the air thick with anticipation. Backstage, dancers moved in a flurry, stretching, adjusting their costumes, whispering last-minute reassurances. The steady hum of the audience beyond the curtain sent a pulse through the floor. Theodore stood in the wings, his hands clenched at his sides, his heart beat a hammering rhythm in his chest. His breath felt shallow, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Amara stood beside him, her expression calm, unreadable. Breathe, she murmured. You've done the work. Now dance. Theodore exhaled slowly, nodding. But his gaze flicked toward the front row, scanning the audience. His father was there, seated in his usual composed posture, but this time, something was different. William wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't distracted. He was watching him. The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. Next up, Theodore Montgomery. Everything went silent. The stage lights were blinding as Theodore stepped forward, each footfall a test of his own resolve. He took his position, spine straight, hands poised. Then, the music began. For the first few beats, his body refused to move. The fear crept in, the whispers of doubt curling at the edges of his mind. But then, he remembered. Control the rhythm. Decide the movement. He exhaled, and then he let go. The first step was precise, the second smoother. His body moved before his mind could interfere, muscles responding to the music like they had been trained to. The stage no longer felt like an unforgiving battlefield. It felt his. Each spin, each extension, each leap, everything he had worked for, everything Amara had drilled into him, came together in perfect synchronicity. His heart pounded in time with the music, not from fear but from something else, something stronger. And then came the final sequence, the one that had broken him in rehearsal over and over again. The turn, the jump, the landing, it had to be seamless. He pushed off the ground, time seeming to slow for the briefest moment. Then he landed. Steady, perfect. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, the applause erupted. Theodore stood there, chest rising and falling, the roar of the crowd pressing against him. He scanned the faces in the audience, his vision blurring with the intensity of it all. Then he found him. William Montgomery was on his feet, clapping. Not just watching, not just observing, applauding. And then, the impossible happened. William leaned forward slightly, his lips moving, his voice barely audible through the noise. Good job, son. A breath of relief and something dangerously close to pride swelled in Theodore's chest. The results came minutes later. The winner of this year's competition is Jackson Hayes. The crowd cheered as Jackson stepped forward, his expression confident, the gold trophy gleaming in his hands. Theodore's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to remain still, his posture straight. He had done his best. That had to be enough. Then, the announcer continued. We would also like to present a special award for artistic expression, one that recognizes not just technical skill, but passion, connection, and heart. This award goes to Theodore Montgomery. The applause rose again. A medal was placed around his neck, lighter than he had expected, but somehow it carried more weight than he could have imagined. As he stepped off the stage, Theodore found his father waiting. There was no judgment in William's eyes, no expectation of perfection. Just something steady, real. Theodore hesitated. Are you disappointed? William looked at him for a long moment before placing a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm, grounding. You made them see you. That's winning. Theodore swallowed past the emotion tightening his throat, nodding. As they stepped outside, the night air crisp against his skin, Theodore turned to his father, uncertainty flickering in his voice. Can I keep dancing? William exhaled, then for the first time in years he smiled. Of course. We're just getting started. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.